to go. Miss Newman, how are you today?
Hello, doing well. How are you?
Good. Thanks for
Thanks
joining.
for
It's great
having
to
me.
see. Of course, yeah. Glad we could get you on Square Pizza Pie. You know, you're the first distinguished guest of 2022, so no pressure.
Well,
But we're starting
look
the
at
year off
that.
strong.
Happy
Starting
New
the year off
Year.
strong with
Happy
you. That's right.
happy 2022. Let's go.
Love the enthusiasm already. You're coming from Nashville, right?
Yes, I'm in Nashville.
How are things going in Nashville?
Things are going well, I mean, we're all, I feel like, navigating so much.
Yeah.
Nashville has, I think within the past year, overcome two tornadoes. Um, we're just getting back in the building after being out last week because of snow, which
Mm-hmm.
kind of shuts our city down.
Mm-hmm.
And, the global pandemic that the world is navigating. We are, as a school, just doing our best to keep our children and families safe, our staff safe, and well, safe and well during this time. So yeah, there's a lot that we're definitely navigating as a city. But there's so many mantras, right? Like purpose prep strong, Nashville strong. So there's definitely a sense of resiliency as we overcome them and just keep pushing for better.
That's great. I know we'll get into this, but we first got to connect while I was in Nashville, but it's been so long since I've been back, both personal but professional. So glad to hear things are going as well as they can, given the weather and the pandemic and all else that's happening that we're all kind of dealing with.
Right. Yeah, definitely thankful for what is that, like 2012, 2013, when I was stalking your classrooms and school and Nashville Prep.
We
And,
didn't agree to talk about that. We didn't agree to give me feedback live on my poor teaching practices back in the day.
No, I mean, we learned so much from the work that you all were founding in our city, in North Nashville in particular. So definitely took a lot of inspiration from y'all's work, and so many different, models and ideas and visions have just come together and been solidified in the purpose prep way. So we're definitely grateful for those that came before us.
I mean, nice of you to say, but certainly, I mean, maybe you and I are both biased, but cool to think about, maybe just some of the talent and the people, but also the policy that was happening in 2010 and 11 in Nashville, and also maybe Tennessee that's not happening right now. Just around the initiatives focused on bringing equitable education options to students and families in Nashville and other areas. I think that maybe policy scene has changed a little bit in Tennessee, but also in other markets like where I come to you now from Charlotte. Certainly not as much of a clear focus here as I think what it was at that time in 2011, 12, and 13 with some of the initiatives happening in town.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm thankful for that time because it's what opened up the climate to be receptive to schools like Purpose Prep, schools that, had a mission on really making sure children received a really excellent education. And I think that, as we think about, Purpose Prep is 9 years old, we're going up for our 10-year renewal, and we have demonstrated results behind us that we're really proud of. But I also don't see that there's been a shift in terms of how are we learning and growing from the schools that have been successful. How are we collaborating as a community and outside of the labels, right? Outside of the, like, you're a charter versus a district. Like, the reality is there is still in our city the majority of children that are unable to read and write and do math on grade level. And that continues to be a problem that just has plagued us. And I just wish that there was more urgency to leverage best practices. It's not rocket science. We know what works. We have to implement it and implement it with high degrees of fidelity. And we've seen it in action. And why are we not being more proactive about collaborating and leveraging the resources that we can share to make sure that children, regardless of what type of school they're in, gets what they deserve?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I want to get to, I think, both the urgency and probably the fidelity that I know you as a leader and you in the school have had such great success with. But you mentioned something I think really important there that maybe not our whole listening audience knows is kind of around the renewal process for charters. So I think oftentimes if you're not well baked into this world, you hear about charters and districts and beef and whatnot, but you don't necessarily hear about maybe what charters go through around the renewal process and how charters can get shut down or continue to stay
Mhm,
open and kind of have to prove they are being effective in order to continue.
mhm.
So will you mind just sharing more about that renewal process for charters?
Of course, there's so much accountability that comes from being a charter school where we have to adhere to the regulations of the district and of the state. There's high levels of transparency in our reporting around everything, academic data, our finances, the teaching and staffing and student enrollment. Like there's so many different metrics that we have to adhere to, we have to meet, but also have to share transparently in reporting. Um, the unique thing, and often when I think about the school district, one of the things that I think about is just how is it that so many people can be beholden to a system that has been failing for decades upon
Mm,
decades upon decades, right? It often surprises me that people don't want to be critical about systems that have honestly never been effective for children. And I think part of that is that they've been allowed, right? Certain structures have been allowed to just chronically fail. And because that's the status quo, it's just been what's been allowed.
mhm.
What's unique about charter schools is that we have to not only meet the requirements of our charter, which is what we got approved based off of, but we also have to, on a cyclical basis, so every 10 years, we have to show over the course of that time frame what was our impact. Did we meet the goals of our charter? What is our vision for the next 10 years? And have to go through an approval process to be renewed,
Right.
to continue to operate. And while some people may think that that's a tedious process, and it is, I welcome it because I
Mm,
think that that's such a great process to say, are you meeting the needs of our district? Are you fulfilling the goals that you set out to fulfill? Are families and children benefiting from your work? And if they are, wonderful. Let's continue to renew this contract and keep going.
right.
And if you're not, then you're not adding value to the work that we're doing as a community, and therefore, we no longer need your service. And I think it's a great accountability piece that charter schools are held to.
Yeah, and a few thoughts I'd love for you to build off of if you feel comfortable. I think for those that don't know, the charter renewal process for the states that allow charters, what, like 40 to 40, 45 maybe across the country, somewhere like that. So, but I think everyone has a different scale for when they have to reapply, right? Whether it's 10 years or 5 years or something like that. So I think that's point one. I think point two, the origination of charters was kind of that with greater flexibility, some flexibility compared to some districts. They would, on the back end, they'd have to prove that that flexibility helped with the accountability piece and the renewal process to your end as well. But as you said, we also know like the larger districts and systems don't have that kind of, let's say, level of accountability or potential or need to renew. They're mostly open forever unless a superintendent closes it, which is pretty rare. So I guess I'm curious, like, have you seen any conversation or just like thought around the trade-offs with running a high performing charter like you are, but knowing you have to adhere to that accountability bar, and perhaps what it could look like in 10, 20 years if district schools or more traditional schools ever have to adhere to a level of accountability with potential closure similar to a charter?
I think what I still hear, which is surprising because charter schools have been operating for long enough for people to really have the facts down. I think
Mhm.
I'm still surprised that there's so many myths that negate some of those things that are part of the practice of us operating. And an example of that would be, you know, people not understanding that charter schools have accountability measures. I was
Mhm.
literally at a school board meeting here in the district, And there were board members who were literally saying that they don't have charter schools that is under their governance. And so, yes, part of that is true in the sense that charter schools have their own board and their governing bodies. That is absolutely true. But what that information is missing is the fact that overarching of the charter school structure is the Metro Nashville public school structure, or the structure of the school district.
That's right.
So yes, again, our decisions and our daily governance is handled at the school level. There's still broader accountability that we're held to that's based on our school district. So I think that it still surprises me how uneducated educated bodies are with how charter schools are run. I know that's like a paradox to be uneducated and you're part of an educated, governing body. But I do see like there's a lot of like misconceptions that are still being perpetuated by the actual people who you would seek for understanding around this information.
Right.
So that makes it really difficult. So I say that to say a lot of people, and I'm glad that you're, bringing this out of this conversation. A lot of people do not understand that there are so many accountability measures. And actually our charter office had a conversation with our school about that shortly after one of those meetings at the district, because they were like, there needs to just be more opportunities for the charter school office of the district to be educating the broader district around what is the overlap, what is the intersection that exists that enables us to be able to work together and meet the needs and goals of the district that we are absolutely being held accountable to.
Right. And so many things would be ideal in this world, but one to build off of this conversation, like that education and kind of charter school 101 policy would have happened 10, 20, 25 years ago when charters first came to Nashville or Tennessee to get ahead of it. And of course, there's always a renewal and a re-education in an ideal sense, but I think also as well, there's the lack of education around the nuance of charters and other models of education. And also maybe not necessarily in Nashville or in Charlotte, but also just the misnarrative or the wrongful narrative of what charters are and aren't, and oftentimes pushing those things that aren't true. So it's harder to get to the actual facts and education, to have more coherent conversations and factual conversations is certainly something we've seen in our work across North Carolina and some other markets we've been in as well.
Yeah. And I think I wrote an op-ed about this, about just, we really need to stop being so divisive about the types of schools. And in it, I reflect on, as a Black woman, I am of the community that I serve. And oftentimes, because I'm a charter leader, I'm pitted against the district as if like I'm not for public education. And it's like, one, charter schools are public schools. Two, families of the district are asking and demanding for additional options. That's why they are selecting themselves to be a part of, charter schools. And so I don't like feeling like I'm not a part of the public, like I very much am. My children will go to schools in the district now, whether that be charter, magnet, obviously at elementary, it'll be charter at Purpose Prep. But whether that's, like I'm a part of the district, I believe strongly in public education. I just believe in high quality opportunities for families. And I think that when you have a district and I think sometimes it can feel negative to say that the district is failing, right? I think that there's some offense taken where it's like, oh, how could you talk about schools like that? But the reality is we have to come to terms with there are schools that are being challenged. Even Purpose Prep, like coming out of the pandemic, our data was like tough to really grapple with, like, wow, we did not serve children as well as we wanted to during this pandemic. Yes, there were lots of things that we did well, but there were lots of things that we needed to do differently to give children what they deserved. our results were still significantly higher than, neighboring schools, but that's not a proud point, right? When you're
Sure.
really thinking about serving children equitably, right? So I think it's like, we've got some learning to do. We've got some assessment to do. We've got some critical analysis within ourselves. And I think when you don't have a spirit to lean into your areas of growth and say, this is a problem, like we're not serving children well, like what are the things that we need to do? If you're not being critical in that way, then you're not being aggressive about really making changes that will support progress. And that's what I sometimes see. I see so much denial
Mm.
that takes place around districts or systems that have been very unsuccessful in terms of educating children, and particularly children of color, children from economically disadvantaged communities, like, being very challenged, but not willing to lean in and say, like, what are the solutions? What do we need to do? What is the accountability that we need to hold? Instead, what I hear is, oh, our if we're not being successful, let's blame other entities for why we're not successful. And we all know that if you're constantly looking outward as to why you're not being successful, then you're never really taking the internal steps that you need to actually drive progress or drive success. And again, that's just the cycle that I'm seeing that takes place, which is not making the progress that our children deserve and they need here in our city.
Yeah. I mean, I know that's why that mindset and that philosophy to be vulnerable as a leader, but also reflective has allowed you guys to be so successful, which we'll get to in a minute. But to build off your first point, we make a lighthearted joke on our team, or at least I do. I don't know if anybody else does, because we work with both charters and districts and other, related organizations. But essentially we say the fastest way to close the charters for districts to give a really good experience to those they're currently serving, because it's so hard as a family to be frustrated with the current school, seek out another option, apply, get the uniforms, meet a school leader like you, even though you're lovely. That takes a lot of gumption from any family to pursue that. And again, you and I and many others believe in school options, but if families are really satisfied with the services and they are being provided, they'll stay at those schools.
Yeah. And honestly, educators too. Like, I mean, the reason why, I started out as a district school educator, and I was just overwhelmed by the levels of dysfunction that was taking place in my school building. As a teacher, like I saw radical progress taking place, but it wasn't because I was being observed or supported or collaborated with my teams. It was often a lot of external organizations that I was a part of, namely Teach for America, that was coming in or providing, professional learning communities, or I'm out with other teachers outside of my school trying to figure out what to put into my instruction that's going to support students to be successful. So it was that experience that really told me that, like, I want to be a part of impacting children in significant ways. And I don't want that to just be, because they were in Miss Newman's like 5th grade class. Like, what about 6th grade? What about 7th grade? What about their K to, what about their elementary experience? And so it was being in a system that I felt was so ineffective. And I felt that the longer that I would be in that system, the more complacent I would become, where like now I'm okay with the status quo. This is acceptable to me. And that actually terrified me. I said, no, that's not what I want. If I'm going to do this work, I want to be positioned to do it well. And I want it to be in a way that children are transforming. The education that they're receiving is high quality and excellent. We're being very thoughtful about how we're empowering our children through their educational experiences. So it was my understanding as an educator of the dysfunctions that I was experiencing that forced me to look at other options. And therefore, here I am as a charter school leader and founder. But I think that you're right. If there were more, if the system was working in a way that served children well, then there would be an interest both from families, children, students, and staff, teachers, leaders to be a part of that. But that's just not the reality.
And in a good segue, not only are you a charter founder and a leader, but a pretty well decorated and incredible one, both from quantitative and qualitative data that we'll get to here in a moment. But can you give kind of broad strokes? We kind of dove right in, which is great. But if we zoom out a little bit, just tell our listening audience about Purpose Prep, how long you guys have been around, and what makes you guys so great.
Yes. Purpose Prep in Nashville, Tennessee. We're a kindergarten through fourth grade. We're going through the process of adding fifth grade now.
Great.
Very proud of the work that we've been able to do over the course of the 9+ years, if you kind of take into account the founding and just mobilization of our community. But feel really connected to our community. Oftentimes, it's not as highlighted around charter schools, but I really feel like we're a neighborhood school. We really are intentional, although we serve children throughout the district, and that's a requirement of being a charter school. The majority of our children come from North Nashville, which is, it's a beautiful community. It's a historically African-American community. There's so many, there's so much just history and just empowerment in that history. You have your HBCUs, Tennessee State, Fisk, Meharry in that community.
Sure. Shout out to Tennessee State, the home of the fifth grade Nashville Prep founding class for the first year.
Yeah. So it's a beautiful community, but it's also historically underserved. The city has not made the proper or even equitable investments in that community. So it's also one of the most impoverished communities in our city. And a lot of just neglect of the city and structural oversights have contributed to that. And education is a part of that. The school district, that cluster of schools that are in that community are historically the lowest performing. And when Purpose Prep came, we were really committed to that community. We wanted to show what was possible. And there were other, charter schools like the work that you did at Nashville Prep that was also committed to that. So shout out to you all again for paving the way for us at the elementary level. We came in and, within 3.5 years of operating, we were one of the top elementary schools in not just our cluster, not just our district, but in the state. And so we were actually rewarded for being the top 5% in academic performance across schools in the state, which was huge. And then we earned that recognition again. There were different criteria for what qualified as a reward school that following year, but it was our second time of being honored as a reward school. So we've just been really proud of, that academic success and of really being able to be a proof point for what's possible for our community. It's been awesome to see how our work has evolved over time. I think that there's been an added element of Purpose Prep of really wanting to make sure that we are thoughtful and intentional about the curriculum and the ways in which we empower and affirm our students through what they're learning. I think that's really important to us, given the majority African-American population that we serve. And so there's been a lot of just action steps that we've taken within the last few years, even more so than when we were founded, to be really thoughtful about, what we're exposing students to. And I'll give you an example. Hold on one second.
Please.
Let me just.
Okay. For those listening, I think Lagra is going to grab a real work product.
But
here.
I'll give you, we're so proud of this. So we created and updated our alphabet.
Oh,
and
cool.
So as you can see, right, we were thoughtful about how do we affirm our children, right? How do we have more representation that reflects them? But also, how do we draw upon their history and really inspire them? So starting in elementary, they're learning that A is for Africa and celebrating the resources and wealth of the motherland, right? And then also being empowered from a community standpoint and core value standpoint. So, we really are just proud of, again, the additional, ways in which we've been able to not only make sure that they're strong readers, writers, and mathematicians, but also make sure that they're just so confident and proud of who they inherently are, which unfortunately in our nation isn't reinforced enough when it
Yeah.
comes to children of color. And we're excited to really be the foundation that they receive that sends them into the world with their heads high, knowing like who they really are, and the power that's behind that.
I love that. And I want to go back to some of the results. I think two things when we were professionally stalking you slash researching, right? One of the recent National Business Journal articles you had jumped out was like your focus and drive around impact and results. And those two things, I think to your point around accountability, if more school leaders, charters, districts anywhere have a real clear focus on what impact and results look like, it's at least a North Star to begin to get to providing equitable options for the students you serve. And then from there, I think it's likely, right, allowed you to be, as you said, top 5% of schools or be a reward school in Tennessee. And I think it's really important because, we're in this education space. And so we know about these awards and achievement and academic results. But I think in any other sense, it's essentially be like a business that didn't exist, that started up and was founded by an incredible leader like you. And within 2 years or back-to-back years, they are automatically outperforming or performing within the top 5% of every other business in the city and the state in terms of these metrics. And I just think from that lens, it's incredible that there was a school that didn't exist anywhere besides your head and in year zero and probably a bunch of Excel sheets and tabs to then existed in real life, brick and mortar, babies, food being delivered, buses, and literally outperforming some of the most wealthiest schools and districts in the state.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we that's what we wanted. That's what we knew was possible, right? Like I think it's just a matter of like there's enough for us to know how brilliant our children are. And if we're not delivering on that in terms of them being able to manifest that in the ways in which they read, write, demonstrate their knowledge, then it's on us. It's on us as not providing them with the tools and the inputs. And so we spent, years researching, studying intensely. What are schools doing? What are the best practices? This isn't something that we need to, invent. We know that there are best practices out there. So then our job was to really know and own those best practices and make sure that we were practicing and being skilled in the implementation of that. And that's what we have done. And that's what we continue to do. I mean, I think that there's growth in that all the time in terms of how can we get better here? How can we, make this tweak and adjust this? So it's a constant learning process, which I think makes this work so rigorous too. It's so challenging because it's like, how do we get better and better, and making sure we're serving and meeting the needs of all students? And children are different; they come with different needs. So making adjustments given that. So it's been a process, but I think it's been grounded in the study of excellence and the implementation of those practices to make sure that we are delivering on the promise that is in our community and just needs to be brought out.
So if there's other school leaders out there, they're currently running a school or aspiring to run one, and they want to have the results you and your team at Purpose and families and students have been able to achieve, I'm going to ask you a bad question, but if you could boil it down to 1 to 2 key like must do's or must factors, what would you offer to those school leaders listening?
Well, I think there's 2 that I would say that really take precedence. One is know your why. The work is so hard and you really have to be committed, because to found a school or to be a school leader, your school needs you in the long term. So I knew when I founded a school that, my minimum was minimally 5 years. Like I knew that I needed to see the school to full capacity. And
by capacity, you mean like K4, so
yeah,
all
because we
5 grade
started with
levels.
kindergarten and
That's
then
right.
first and so until 4th grade. So I knew that I wanted to see that fully grown. But what I also tell leaders around this piece around finishing the school to a point where you've done right from a long-term standpoint. And mind you, I'm in year 9 now, and I don't see myself going anywhere. But what I would also say is it was also at that time where I started to see the shift of the work being really beneficial to me.
Mm.
I think that when you start this work as a school leader, it's to give, and you're depleted, you're giving your all. You don't have the proper, and there is no like 50-50 work-life balance ever. I should say that, but it's definitely not anything that you would find to be equitable. It takes precedence, and it's really difficult. It's really hard. But it was me seeing it to the end and continuing to stay on that has allowed me to reap benefits that I never imagined having, that I'm so grateful for. I feel like this work is sustainable. I feel like I really, really enjoy what we've created here. The people that I've been able to work with, like, I was telling our director of academics, like, she's pregnant now, and I want to continue just to do life with you as we grow ourselves, our families, and the
Yeah.
work that we're doing here at Purpose Prep. So there's so many, I think, benefits that the leader starts to receive after they've put in that work to get the school to what it needs to be, that I think if you leave prematurely, you really miss out on. So I would definitely say know your why, and have that commitment in the long term. And then the second piece is really around clarity of vision.
Mm.
Know exactly what it is that you want your school to look like, or what the school should look like. What are those best practices? What do they look like? Why do they exist? Like, really having examined that to a high degree of detail to make sure that you're very clear. Because I remember in those initial years of operating, I was able to really shift things that weren't going in the right direction because of my vision.
Mm.
Oh, that doesn't feel right, look right, sound right. That's not how I want it. It's not fitting there. And so I was able to really be able to assess and adjust because I was very clear, versus having a murky vision and being like, I think that's okay, or allowing things to be accepted when they shouldn't have been. It was the clarity of vision that I was able to really act upon because I had high level of insight regarding what I wanted and what it needed to look like, and was able to also provide that to my team who could embody that vision as well.
And specific to your why, is that what has kept you in your seat for the 9 years, as you've mentioned? So, I mean, 9 years is an incredible amount of time, whether you're a teacher, a dean, a school leader, a principal in a traditional school, or just an executive in any role, right? That's an incredible tenure, but also the incredible results that you've been able to achieve. So is it to some of those benefits, but also the why you've mentioned about what drives you to stay in that position?
Absolutely. I'm so passionate about this work, and it really does keep me grounded. To share a little bit about my why, um, I was brought up in a household where my parents were so focused on me receiving an excellent education. It was literally like one of those things where, like, if they were going to get anything right, it was going to make sure that I got, good grades,
Right.
was in, good schools. My parents, at one point in my elementary career would drive an hour each way to get me to a private school they had placed me in,
Wow.
because they believed that that was just the best environment for me.
Yeah.
And so I saw a lot of sacrifices at a young age around the prioritization of education for me. And I don't think I really understood it until I was older and really understood the story of my parents.
Mm.
But my father was incarcerated at a young age when he was a juvenile.
Mm.
And that really resonated with him because he talks about, and he's told me that it was actually that experience of being, locked away, that he actually felt that he started to actually get an education. And in some ways, I've recently read Malcolm X autobiography, but like,
Mhm.
going to jail is not how people should like self-educate themselves, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's the narrative sometimes
Especially
of
in the
like,
richest country
we're-
in the world.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, but my dad was able to, have resources that he wasn't having in schools, or have access to opportunities that he wasn't exposed to in his community, in his schools. And so it was a turning point for him, and turn fully he did. But my dad, even still, is like my advisor. I feel like
Mm.
he's like the one of the wisest people I know, and I go to him for advice and insight. And I constantly, he's just a living example of someone who the system did not manifest him to be his fullest self. And like he was able to take their failure and reconstruct how he made sure his children had what they needed so that they, didn't have a similar path. And I appreciate the moves and changes he made on behalf of us. But how many children that have that capacity, brilliance, wisdom are we leaving behind because they're not able to receive what they deserve? So he's been a large part of my why. My mom, similarly, they grew up in the same area in Washington, D.C., but she actually graduated with her bachelor's degree when I graduated from high school. So I got to see, when I was in high school, my mom navigating her education and getting, again, what was delayed, but what she was able to accomplish. So proud of both of my parents for not only the example that they instilled in me, and the choices that they made to make sure that I got what I needed to be successful. And I know that a lot of my success is because of my education and certainly because of my family and their decisions. But I'm also just so proud of the personal choices that I saw them make for themselves in their adulthood, that also informed me of just how important education is. And so that's why I am so passionate about this work and wanting to make sure that our children get what they deserve so that they can have situations that set them up for success in a way that my parents and the system didn't allow my parents to have.
Yeah, that's incredible. I appreciate you sharing. And me personally came from a similar background in terms of my parents not going to school until much later on, but growing up in a household that your butt was going to school somewhere and you're going to do a good job and get a good experience because it's supposed to set you on a good track, which I know is the experience you're seeking to serve, right, and providing for your families and your students as well.
Yeah. And how great is it? So I saw that your mom is a part of the
She's part of the
organization.
team. She operates my
And
life and operates the business at the same time.
well, that was my mom. My mom was the office manager for Purpose Prep.
Oh,
in the
good.
area.
Yeah, good connection.
Yeah, so she that was her way of sewing. She always said she was sewing back into Purpose Prep because she was just so proud and passionate about education as well. So I'm sure that there's that same synergy between you and your mom, which is awesome.
I'm sure you and I can share what works and what doesn't about moms managing up in a professional day-to-day world in a good way, more so than others, but nonetheless, that's a separate podcast episode. And you and literally every other school leader right now is this challenge is to run schools, but also run it through a pandemic, right? And COVID. And so now there's so many in Charlotte and in Nashville and other areas struggling with bus drivers and teacher shortages and just academics and getting students in. So we could talk, could probably write a whole book about what you're experiencing and adjusting to. But would love to hear kind of what's been working for you during COVID and what's happening to best serve your students and families given the current climate we're in the January of 2022.
Yes. I mean, it's definitely a difficult time. Yeah, it's a lot to grapple with. And I think what educators and what school leaders have been able to do and accomplish, we've kept this education thing going, even though we've had to transition it to virtual or hybrid and in person, masked up. It's just it's been a lot to do what we needed to do to keep our families and communities and children and staff and each other safe. So I mean, I would say, I think that like what I've learned through this time, yes, there are some best practices that we've implemented, but I think some of the things that I've learned is like giving yourself grace during this time, right? Like it's okay to, not have it all figured out. It's okay to navigate in the uncertain. I mean, I remember literally, the COVID happening, we're going virtual and like my daughter was like 1 at the time. And so I'm like juggling her on Zoom with staff meetings and feeling, stress and pressure to perform over Zoom. But I also have a 1-year-old who's like with her mom right now and
Yeah.
needing that, and so I just had to really process like what it meant to give myself grace, because I believe as a school leader, you can only do for others what you do for yourself. And I've learned that,
Mhm.
even in our founding years, like I had to learn, what does it mean to care for myself? Because I couldn't care for my staff if I wasn't even giving myself a level of care.
Sure.
And so that's something that I encourage, you know, all of us as we navigate this time, to give ourselves grace. Um, so that we can give grace to others and understand like the intersection between results and like doing this in a humane way.
Mm.
Like we're navigating a global pandemic. And so what is taking precedence right now? Health,
Yeah.
safety. And that's okay, right? Cuz that's really important. Like if we don't have people who are alive and well, then they won't be educated. Education is so important. Don't get me wrong, that needs to be a huge priority. Um but not to the detriment of other things that need to be in place. And I think this pandemic forced us to think about those things, like what is keeping our community well? What is keeping us safe? And then how are we going to build upon that to make sure that we're continuing to deliver results and provide, the needs to our children. We're glad to be back in the building. I think that, we've seen our results skyrocket,
Mm.
back to pre-pandemic, and now we're even building from that, because we're back in the building where the human connection is really, really positive for children. And it allows, children to be more focused, obviously, than if they're in their living rooms, at home.
Right.
So with that being said, I think that, we need to push our community to do what we need to do to keep each other safe. These anti-mask, board meeting rallies, to me, is just coming from such a selfish, individualistic standpoint. We have children who need to be kept safe. And if like the small inconvenience of wearing a mask supports their safety and their like health, then
Yeah.
that's the least we can do. And I just wish that we were a more community oriented nation, right? That said, like, small inconveniences that literally could be life or death for someone else, I'm okay with it.
Mm.
But instead, that's just not the spirit. And so I think like I'm trying to make sure that our community stays grounded in our care for each other, and why that is what's going to keep us safe, keep us well, and keep us able to continue to operate in person so that we can do what we need to do to support our children.
Yeah. I think always thinking about the greater good, both in education, but also, as you said, around health, given the effects of COVID and how it adapts or doesn't adapt is so important. So I appreciate you lifting that up. Going to get you out of here on a few semi rapid fire ones, because I usually don't.
Okay.
I usually talk too long. What's one thing, Miss Newman, you wish you would have known about leading a school before you started leading or founding a school, founding or leading, because those are two different things, right?
hmm I would definitely say just the history of education. I think that
Mm.
there's been a lot of learning that I've done, just educating myself about what did education look like, especially for Black people, after slavery, during slavery. What were the consequences, and what impact did that have on us? I think that the historical insights that I've been able to develop over the course of the past few years have been so critical to my understanding of just systems and structures, and it's just been really important. And I think that I wish I had just learned that earlier. There's a documentary called By Design, the
Mm.
shaping of education in Nashville schools, and it's by the Public Education Foundation here
Okay.
in Nashville. It's so powerful, and it really speaks to
And it's
the
pretty
pros and
recent.
cons of Brown versus Board. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's within the past few months.
Okay, great.
But it's really powerful. It draws upon a lot of strong research and background that's already been developed about the city, but highly recommend it. And again, I think that those are the type of gems, from a historical standpoint, that I wish that I knew, because I think it could have more quickly expedited just my level of insight and knowledge around like history and the impact that that has on our community and how we move and operate, like how we pull from what we've learned from the past to make our present and future better.
Yeah, that's good. And I'll definitely check that out. I wasn't aware, but also one thing that comes to mind when you think about the history recently of education, to me recently, but the larger term in the country, and Sharif El-Mekki out of Philly in the Center for Black Educator Development talks a lot about this, but that there was such a rich history and amount of African-American teachers before,
Yes.
right? And in our country, and so much of the integration negatively affected the jobs and the amount of African-American teachers in our country and who they were teaching based upon the kids and the skin color of the kids in those classrooms. And I think that history is not taught in our schools. It's not taught in many higher ed institutions, and understanding how we got here, to your point, by design, but also, but I think just also what's available to understand, and how we deliver that and how we make sure that is known to the greater good is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So much respect for their work. I watch they have a podcast with Freedom Fridays, and I feel like there's so many gems of learning there. But something else that people don't know is, so there's a lot of pictures around Ruby Bridges, right? And like this young precious little girl who's like climbing these steps, all of these irate, this white mob behind her, and security escorting her in. But what people don't know is that she was faced even more brutality when she stepped into those doors. Not a single one of the white teachers wanted to teach her. So literally they had to bring a teacher from the North to be her teacher for the year, and she was the only pupil in the class for the entire school year. So that mob didn't leave when she stepped inside of the doors of that school building.
Yeah. Wasn't just rainbows.
And so literally she's walking in, there's children in other classes, and she's, a little girl, like confused as to why am I the only student in the classroom, coming from a school where like she had peers, they played at recess, to a school where like she has to eat lunch by herself. She has a teacher who came from the North because no one in the entire school wanted to teach her. Like, and we talk about education and the system of education, like how was that equitable for Ruby? What work did the system have to do to be ready to receive her? Because they hadn't done their work. That school hadn't done their work. And so how do we expect now children to receive an excellent education when teachers don't want to teach them? And I'll say that, yes, it's 2022, but there's still a lot of those teachers that exist today, and why children are not receiving the excellent education that they deserve. It's not because of them, and it's not because they don't have the capacity. It's because there are teachers who still do not want to teach them. And I think until we start to have those honest conversations around what's happening when children step inside of the school building, right, then we're not going to see the type of changes that we need to see. And that's, again, why schools like Purpose Prep is so important, because we want our children. We know that they're capable and they have the capacity, and we're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that that is manifested through the learning experience that they have here.
And speaking of purpose, what's one thing our listening audience can do to support your work?
Reach out to us on our website, purposeprep.org, and we're eager to have talent, time, or treasure. So whatever you can give us, we are eager for. Again, very proud of our work, and want more people to be involved in it, whatever capacity that may look like for that individual. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. And again, our website is purposeprep.org.
We'll put it in the show notes and when we share the podcast and the episode as well. Most important question of the day, as always, what does square pizza remind you of, Miss Newman?
A puzzle. A
Puzzle.
puzzle.
It's a new answer.
Puzzle.
Say more.
Listen,
Say more.
yes.
Yeah, go.
I thought about it and I said, the power of a square pizza is like a puzzle. There's different elements that are coming together to make a whole. And like I envision this square pizza having like pepperoni over here and
Okay.
mushrooms over here and spinach over here
No mushrooms.
and these
No, we don't
toppings,
mess with
right? Like
mushrooms. We don't mess with mushrooms,
but
but I get it. Go ahead.
but the toppings really adding to the diversity that constructs like what this whole pizza is going to look like. So
I mean, I can't say that was the best answer ever, given the respect we have for all of our other guests, but I'm so glad I asked because that was so great.
well, thank you.
Ms. Newman, thanks so much for joining the Square Pizza Pod and all the work you're doing. I
Thank you for
mean,
having
obviously in Nashville, but of course, as a leader across the country as well.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here. And thank you for the good work you're doing and for elevating and using this platform to elevate the work of Purpose Prep. I appreciate it.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.